Hi, in this video I'd like to show you a brand new theme that I've released called AdminTW. So I released this theme as a static version a while ago, and it's built with Tailwind CSS, and it's got a sprinkling of Alpine for some of the interactivity. Today I've actually built it into Laravel, and I built it on top of Laravel Laravel Breeze. So I'm just going to go for how it kind of looks and why it exists really. So I was thinking for most projects you want a really simple starting point to start off with, and Laravel Breeze is a really good starting point where you've got the authentication built in, and it's quite a nice interface to work with. But I think it just boils down to personal preference. I prefer sidebar based layouts, and Breeze is more your top based layout. So that's why I've designed this one, so it'll become clear once I log in. So this is the landing page, so the welcome view. So I've just kept this really simple. So it's just got a logo on there, but that can just be, that can be changed. And then we've just got the standard login buttons. So if I go to the login page, the style is essentially the same as Breeze. All I've really done is just put a different logo at the top of this page. So if I just log into an account that I've already created, so this takes me into the dashboard, and is where it sort of separates from where Breeze is laid out. So the navigation on here is down the side rather than across the top. I prefer it down the side, so to me it makes more sense to do it this way. Also there's a menu at the top, which similar to you've got on Breeze, so you can open your account. Only I've just added an extra element in place where you can edit your actual details. So if we click onto that, this takes us to a Laravel component, and this is where we can see the email address and name. And because it's Laravel, we've got real-time validation built in, so as I make a change, it's updated straight away. Likewise, if I try and update it, then it actually goes through the process, updates it, and lets us know if it's been successful or not. So it's fairly straightforward. And then the other thing about this as well is it's responsive out of the box. So if I just resize the browser down to a small size, then your menu disappears to the side, and then when I click on the menu, it opens up sort of full screen of your navigation, so you can still navigate around and your sidebar menu still opens. So I think it's quite a nice looking theme. So I've bundled a fair bit with it. You just don't necessarily see it out of the box because I wanted it to keep it pretty straightforward, and maybe added more to the default sort of theme over time. But always initially, you've got the dashboard, and we've got this edit page. Okay, so if we open it up into my theme, and because I'm trying to keep it very similar to how it was traditionally. So if we open up the resources folder and go into views, the only real difference on this version is I prefer things to be inside of their own directories. So in this case, I've created an app directory, and that's where we'll find our user files, also the dashboard files, and then the welcome is in the root representing the front end. We've got Livewire for editing the edit user profile. The auth is pretty much left alone, and then the component. You've got the usual components that you get with Breeze, but I've also added a bunch of my own components that I use from project to project, which are quite useful. So I'll go over some of them shortly. And then inside the app directory, we've got our controllers. Again, standard stuff really. You've got the auth directory, but we've got our app directory where we've got our dashboard controller, and we've got our users controller. So, like I said, I've probably said this a few times already, but it does come with Laravel out of the box, so it means you don't have to get that set up, it's already set up. You've also got Tailwind, you've also got Alpine, so if you're using those technologies, then you get started very quickly. So like I say, if we go into the Laravel, we've got a basic component in here where we can make some changes to basically just the name and the email address for the user's account. What I've also done as well is, because Breeze comes with some tests, I've added onto those tests, so we've got a few additional tests now. So fairly straightforward test, like making sure you can hit the home page and the test passes. Also, we've got some tests for the back end. So again, for the dashboard, just make sure you can hit the dashboard if you're logged in. And then another test for if you're not logged in, then you should be redirected when you try to go to the dashboard, or in this case, go to the app directory, the app sort of route, which is what I've named the dashboard to be. And similar kind of thing for users. So we've got some basic tests for them as well. And then also for any components, I've created this Laravel components folder, and then from here we can actually run some tests for these components. So for this component, I'm just saying, when I go to this route, does this page actually show up this page? And if it does, then it passes. So I can see this component on this page. Also, I'm setting to make sure that the name and email address have been wired to Livewire, meaning that you've got in the view you've got wire model and then name and email to make sure they're updated. And a third test to make sure you can actually update the model, update the method rather than it calls an update method, and make sure that all runs. So if I run the test suite, so I run the whole thing, that runs through the test. So there's 24 tests kind of out of the box with it, and they all pass, so you start green straight away, so it's a really good starting point. So if we look at just to kind of go over some of these areas, some like these components, this is probably a good place to start because there's a few components on this page. So if I look at the resources and views, and I'm going to layout, edit profile. So I've got this new component called card, and all the card is, it's just a box essentially. So it's just X card, doesn't accept any parameters or anything. If I spell it correctly. So if I just save that, come back to the page and refresh it, then we just get out of the box, we just get this white box. Also with this theme, it does support dark mode as well. So if I go to my settings and just change my computer to dark mode, then it automatically changes it to dark mode. So all the menus, they all change to dark mode as well. So it's quite nice to have that. And that's one thing I like about Tailwind, how easy it is to build dark mode into your projects. So it comes all that out of the box. If you don't want to use dark mode, then you don't have to do anything special. But if you do, then it's built there and it's there ready for you to use, which is quite good. So that's the card module. That's the card component. So I use that quite often. So if you're using dark mode, it's as simple as like here I've just got a text styling, and here I'm saying I'm just prefixing this styling with dark. So if we're on dark mode, then this will kick in, so we'll change the grey to a 200, so that way it doesn't become too dark on a dark mode. And then I've not set one up for light mode, so light mode it will just be the default, so like the dark grey text. Now we've got another component here called XAlert, and what that does is if this is successful, then it shows the success message. So I quite like that component. Basically, if we open up the alert, all it is it's a fairly straightforward message. It's just going to display a box. It's color coded. It's going to be default to green, but we can pass a color option to this to override what color we want it to be. And also we're using a flash. Well, we've got to create a parameter called flash with an option of message. And what this is going to do is saying if this session key exists in the array, so if session has this key, then it's going to display this box and output what the content or what it is in that session. And then we're using Alpine to essentially show this box only for a few seconds, and after a few seconds this box then disappears. So if I come back to this page, and for instance if I just change the colour to, say, if I wanted it to be red, I could say that, come back, refresh the page, and then once I submit my page, the component, then we get a red and it disappears on its own. So it's green by default, but if you don't want it to be green, you can just say colour and then pass in the additional colour that you want. Again, quite convenient one to have. And now I've got this xform component, and what this does is it will default to post request. Well, we use input, but behind the scenes it will actually use the CSRF field. So if I open up, again go to the components and open up the form. So by default, if it's not a get request, then it's going to put in the CSRF field, so you don't have to put that in yourself, which is quite useful. And you can put in the extra attributes onto the form itself, which is really handy. And then what it also does is, if you're using a put, patch, or delete, then it will put a post method to the actual form itself, so you don't have to put it in yourself. So it means here it looks like it's kind of like a get request, but we're actually using a put. So behind the scenes it will actually use post. And then I've wired this up to Laravel. If you're not using Laravel, then you don't necessarily need that. So it's just convenience really. And then we've got this row component, and all that one is, it's a simple div with a bit of basic styling to it. And on this, we're just going to say at the medium size, we can use flexbox. I'm going to set spacing to 8 positions, and I use that in conjunction with this xcol, which is for column. And if I just quickly jump into that one, another simple div with basic styling on there, just use half the width of the screen. So I use that quite a lot, so I can say 1 column, 2 column, and if you're doing a typical 2 column layout, this is pretty handy to have in place, because then you can just say row, column, do whatever you want, have another column, do what you want, and close that row down. So I use that quite often because it's just very clean and easy to use. So part of the form for library of components, so we've got a form input library component, and I've wired this up to Laravel, so it's got a name of it's got a model of name. The label is what you'll actually see at this in the actual display, which is quite handy to be to see that. And if you don't pass through a display, then it won't show anything there. And then required, if you put required on, it automatically puts this asterisk in, so you can see that that's required. So what I tend to do is put this on the page just so there's a key for users who are not familiar with what these mean. I think most people are, but for people that are not, then you can see that. So in this one, it doesn't have that required attribute on, so it doesn't show it there. So if I come back and just put required on, come back and refresh, then it has that in place. And then lastly, we've got a button, and the button is just, again, it's just a submit button, and it's just defaults it to the blue color, but that can be overwritten, and you can customize these components however you want. So I've set the button to have a default of type, but you can pass type through and give it a different type if you want to. So it could be like a type button, so then you wouldn't actually submit a form, it would just be a regular button, and has some basic styling on the button itself. And that's all I'm using on that page, but they are quite handy to use. So if I open up the forms folder, there's quite a few different ones I've got in place for buttons, for checkboxes, for file type. They're all fairly straightforward to use. For instance, I'm not sure how to use text area. Behind the scenes, there's a fair bit to it, and it does this so you don't have to write as much when you're using it. So like if you don't pass through, if the label is empty, then it's going to try and get the name to use that as a name element. So it's quite useful to be able to use. Again, you don't have to use these at all. You can easily delete those, and it's not a problem. It's just these are what kind of come out of the box, and I'm a big fan of blade components. I think once you get used to them, they can really speed up your workflow and really make you move quickly. So if we just talk about the actual layout of the system now. So if you open up the app directory, so this is the app layout. So at the top of the page, we've got our normal title. So we've got our title, a title prop, and it's empty by default, which means if you don't provide a title to your page, then you won't see a title appear. It will just say In this case it says AdminTW, but that's because I've set that in my environment file. So whatever the application name is, that's what it will be displayed there. And then we're bringing in the CSS file and JavaScript file for mix. So just box standard Laravel stuff there, so you can change that as you need to. Here we're using Alpine to set the sidebar to be closed by default. And then we've got a button here that only really shows on mobile, or the small breakpoints. That basically says, once you're at a small breakpoint, if you click on this button, it's just going to change the visibility to the opposite of what it currently is. So it will be default to false, so when you click on the button, it will change it to true, and then when you click it again, it will change it back to false. And then for the actual logo, it's really straightforward. We're just using the display of the config. This would be a good place to actually put an actual logo. In this case, it's just text, but you can style that quite easily with Tailwind, or you can put an actual logo in there as well. So next we've got this area, and this is using components. So we're using a component called X dropdown, and with X dropdown it needs a trigger, which is what this one is, and inside the trigger is what you actually see here. So in this case I'm just displaying the username, and then I've got two SVGs to display in the down arrow, and I'm going to click on it, the up arrow. So that'll just change depending on if the X shirt is open or closed, so if it's true or false. Again, they're not required, you can take those off if you don't need them. So if I just close that button down, so that's like your trigger, and then the next element that a drop down requires is a slot called content, and content is what shows up when you click onto it. Then you get this box that shows up, and then so I've come down, that login one's a bit more complicated, but for standard links you can just do X drop down link, and then you do colon href, and then pass through the root of a link that you want it to go through, and then also the text for the link. If you're not using roots, then you can just do URL there instead, and just do your standard URL root. Or if you don't want to do it dynamic root, you can just get rid of the colon and then just pass through the link as normal, should you want to. I kind of like the root ones, so I've tried to use that throughout the system. And then this one's a little bit more complicated. It's just because we've got a form, we've got a traditional form that goes to the logout page, and inside of the form we've got another link. Only this time we're not using the href, we've just got a bit of JavaScript that says when you on-click, don't actually refresh the page, and instead use JavaScript to submit the form, and that will just take you to the actual action of this form. In this case it will take you to the logout page. So that's the top side, and then we get to the main layout area. So first of all we've got this section which is for your sidebar, and then we've got the section underneath it which is also for the sidebar, but you only see that at a mobile breakpoint once it goes down to smaller. And just so you're not repeating yourself, I've used as a single include in both places, so the actual menu is the same regardless if from mobile or desktop, which is quite convenient. And that just shows up this entire menu. So when you're on a small screen, this icon will show up, and then this is your menu coming up, and then you've got the same menu which shows up at the bigger screen. That way you've only got one menu to kind of deal with. Then straight underneath it you've got the main content, which is this area, and because this whole thing is a blade component, rather than using yield we use slots. So we just put in slot, and then whatever we put inside, whatever goes into a view will then be rendered at this point. And then just at the bottom we've just got a standard footer that you can put whatever you want within that. So it's pretty straightforward really. And like I said, we've got Laravel coming in at the bottom and at the top. So the next area is the actual navigation, and this is what gets displayed in the SAD menu. So we've got another component that we're using called xNavLink, and then you just pass through the route to the link, and then internally it uses flex, so you can position items. In this case I've got an icon an SVG logo and the dashboard itself. So for instance, for copy. So if you decide of your project you're not going to use icons, you can just tick that off. In fact, it makes it a bit simple to actually see at a glance. As you can see, it just simply. So if I just refresh that a few times, come back, then you can see you've got your navigation going throughout. So they're your standard like nav links, but you can also do additional types of links. So you can do nav groups. Nav group is when you want to have a drop down, and it requires a trigger and the content. So you say xslot trigger. I'll just put in that to begin with. Come back and refresh. I didn't think it was going to let me do that because it needs the content as well. And the content is what displays when you actually click onto it. So we've now got hello, and that's the nav group. And then when you click onto it, which there isn't anything in there yet, you would see what's within the content. So the good thing about this is that again you could put an icon in there if you wanted to, or just have it as plain text. And then at this point you can then put your links in. So we'll say x nav and group link. And again, if we just put in a route, and I don't really have much routes at the moment, so I'm just going to say put the app route in as we've got above, and we'll just call that app. So if I save that, come back, refresh, we've now got hello, and that now appears when you open up to that page. So it's quite handy to be able to easily create the drop down menus. And if we do it multiple times, so by default it will be closed until you click onto it. You can actually specify, if I go onto one of these and open up, these are actually all kind of highlighted, and it's hard to tell because I've got other links on here. In fact, if I just open up, put in a different route on this one, this bottom one will be a different colour now because it won't be matching. So this is no longer highlighted because this URL doesn't match this page, but it matches all these ones, so that's why these are all highlighted. So what you can actually do is, if I go back to the dashboard, it's not highlighted to begin with, but if you pass through the actual route name to the group, you can then actually specify it. So in this case, if I wanted it to match up against the app route, then it would, when it gets to that dashboard, it would automatically open because it recognises you're on that page. And that's a really convenient way that if you've got a bigger menu, you can get the drop downs to open when you're on these same pages. Likewise, if you're on any of the child pages, the parent will stay open, which is pretty handy. But by default, it's off, and it will actually stay open or do that. So that's it for your navigation, but fairly straightforward. So you've got your standard nav, and then you've got a group, and then you can put your child items within those areas as well. So I'm just going to close this off. Okay, so in terms of just showing the actual theme, that's really in a nutshell. As I'm going to do some more videos of exploring a bit deeper into this. Actually, before I finish, I'll just go over the edit Laravel component and just how that actually works. So what we do is inside of we've got an edit view, and we've got users and edit, and this page, it's just a standard view page. And what I'm doing on here, I'm displaying like the breadcrumb for it, or the actual title, and then I'm importing a Laravel component called edit profile, and I'm passing through the logged in user to that component. So then if I look inside the actual component itself, if I go to the top, so it's fairly straightforward. We'll define the properties of the component. So we're saying that there's a user that's going to be an instance of the user model, and then we've got a name and email. Both of them are going to be strings. We've got the mount where we actually set the name and email address to the properties. And then the render is where we say which view do you actually want to load up for this component. So we pass that path through. And then we're specifying the rules. So we're saying the name and email are both required. Well, the email isn't actually required, which it really should be, so I should make that. Oh no, it's misreading. It is required and it expects an email address. And then if there is any validation messages, and this step isn't necessarily required, but I do quite like to override the messages. So it means if there is an error message, you can customize what that looks like. And then we've got this updated method which just runs as soon as any validation messages to be displayed or to be validated against. And then when you click on the update, that's when this runs. And what it will do is whatever it was within these fields, it updates to these properties and then saves that property, and then it actually creates a session called message with a value of updated, and that's that updated that you actually see when you click on the button and you see it there. So hopefully that's enough to show the theme off, and I'm going to explain the theme a little bit more, but I think generally for most of my tutorial videos this is the theme that I'll be using because it's the way that I prefer to work with the side navigation.